are on the stage as Republican candidates for Kansas governor. I want to remind everyone that the Hutchinson Chamber does not endorse candidates. However, it is in our mission to make sure that we allow our members and community to learn about public policy issues and to interact with our elected officials and those seeking office. Thank you all for joining us tonight. I would also like to give recognition one more time to Hutchinson Regional Healthcare System for being the sponsor this evening, and also wanted to point out that we have Mr. Brian Hurt from the Hutchinson Police Department who is on site keeping us safe and in order tonight. So thank you, Mr. Hurt, for your service. The format for the candidate forum this evening will begin with a 2-minute opening statement from each of our candidates, and we will close again with a 2-minute closing statement from each. Questions will be asked by our panelists who are on the left of the stage, and the first candidate to answer each question will get 1 minute to respond. Each of the 6 candidates will have 1 minute, and then the first candidate to answer will then have a 30-second opportunity for a rebuttal response. We estimate that we're going to have questions from the panelists with about 7 to 9 important questions on topics this evening like economic development, tax policy, highway funding, and the like. Leanne Cox, the vice president of our chamber, is down in front, and she will be timing all of your responses. She will hold up a white 15-second reminder card that you have 50 seconds remaining in your time allotted. When the time is up, she will ring a bell. And with that bell, if you go over the time, I'll just jump in and cut you off as appropriate. The panelists this evening that will be asking questions are from our local news organizations. We have on the left Mr. Ron Sylvester from the Hutchinson News, the editor with the Hutch News. Next we have Mr. Fred Goff, the news director with Eagle Radio. And then on the right we have Mr. Cliff Shank, owner of Ad Astra Per Aspera Broadcasting, and we thank these news outlets for the coverage that they're giving to this important election. Let's give those guys a hand. Thank you. The Hutchinson News also allowed the readers an opportunity to write in questions to a debate email, and so some of the questions woven in this evening come straight from you. So thanks to the readers for that. So I would now like to introduce the candidates that are joining us on stage this evening. We will start on the left. Each of the candidates actually drew a number, and that's the order that they are seated in. So on the left, we'll begin. Mr. Wink Hartman. Wink is the running mate for Mr. Chris Kobach. Wink was born and raised in Wichita, Kansas. Wink has held a variety of positions in his lifetime and presently owns and oversees a variety of companies, including Hartman Oil Company, H2 Trucking, H2 Drilling, H2 Planes, H2 Oilfield Services, Chester's Chop House, the Hartman Arena, and several Jimmy's Egg establishments. He is currently chairman of Vintage Bank Kansas and is a lifetime member of the NRA and the Wichita Chamber of Commerce. Next, we have Mr. Tyler Ruzich. Tyler is currently a senior at Shawnee Mission North High School in Johnson County. He was elected president of his freshman class and has been involved with student government ever since. He currently serves on the City of Prairie Village's Teen Council and is a member of his high school's debate team. Very appropriate for this evening. His running mate is Dominic Scavuzzo. Next, we have Mr. Jim Barnett. Jim grew up on a small farm in Redding, Kansas. He went on to graduate at the KU School of Medicine and has practiced medicine for the last 35 years, the first 28 years in Emporia and now in Topeka. He began his political career while serving on the Emporia School Board of Education and then went on to serve in the Kansas Senate for 10 years. His running mate is his wife, Rosie Barnett. Next, we have Mr. Patrick Kucera, PK, as he introduces himself. PK is a pastor and entrepreneur. He and his wife, Mari, are the founders of Frontline Ministries, which they have successfully run for the last 30 years. His running mate is Patricia Reitz. Next, we have Lieutenant Governor Tracey Mann. Lieutenant Governor Mann is the running mate for Governor Jeff Collier. As a fifth-generation Kansan, he was born and raised on his family farm in Quinter. After graduating college, he spent 2 years working in Washington, D.C. for the National Student Leadership Forum on Faith and Values, before coming back to Kansas to begin a career in commercial real estate. Since the start of his career, he has served on the board of directors for many Kansas groups, including Kansas Agriculture and Rural Leadership and the Kansas Chamber of Commerce. Finally, we have Mr. Ken Selzer, a fourth-generation Kansan, Ken grew up in McPherson and Marion counties. He was elected as the Kansas Insurance Commissioner in 2014 and previously worked in the reinsurance industry for more than 30 years. He currently serves on the Advisory Council of the KSU College of Business and is a member of the Kansas State Foundation Board of Trustees. His running mate is Jen Sanderson. Thank you all for your participation tonight, and with that, we are ready for the opening statements, which will be led by Mr. Wink Hartman.
Thank you very much. I want to thank everybody, first of all, for coming out this evening. It's hot. It's a typical Kansas July weather with a little rain, at least at my house. So thank you for taking time to be informed by the candidates here in front of you. I had a 2-minute opening, but unluckily for me, it was all given earlier in the conversation. So I want you to know one thing, that all of the candidates in front of you have, one time or another, all said they are businessmen or businesswomen. They are in the business world. Well, I sent my DNA in the other day, a little box, and I mailed it in, and the DNA came back. And lo and behold, I didn't have to buy any kilts, or I didn't have to buy any lederhosen. My DNA came back that I was a businessman, and that's all I am. So I will profess that for 50 years, I have been in the world of business. The world of business is where you build equity. Like the citizens of this great state, we need to build equity for you because it is your state. I understand return on investment because your tax dollars are being spent at a very rapid rate in Topeka and being wastefully spent. You deserve a return on your investment. So you need to consider the candidates today. We're all going to have different approaches and different ideas. But please consider, I'm the only one that has the experience to turn the state around and finally, once and for all, have a budget that does balance. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hartman. Next, we will have opening statements from Mr. Tyler Ruzich.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the great people of Hutchinson, Reno County, and the surrounding. If you came here to attend, it really means a lot that this is of concern for you, that you want to be educated and overall make a good informed choice this coming August and, of course, this coming November. I also want to thank the Hutchinson Chamber of Commerce and also Hutchinson Regional Medical Center for making this event possible, and the rest of the candidates that have attended. You know, when it comes to government, it's all about perspective. The experiences that you've had and also your relationship with those that you've met in your relationship with government. As a public school student under the Brownback and Collier administration, I realized what cuts to our public school system does. I've also realized what lack of accountability does to students. If we don't have money that's going to instruction, if we don't have money that's being put in the classroom or instead is being invested in my high school, a whole new high-definition scoreboard that we do not need, or a whole new state-of-the-art administration building, imagine how much money could have been going to schools, could have been going to students, could have been going to instruction to help enhance the educational experience of students here in Kansas, like myself. It's a perspective that I have gained when we're sitting down with teachers, when we're sitting down with other government officials, when we're trying to create a budget that needs to be had. Everyone and every voice needs to be at the table. And I believe it's that unique perspective, not just on education, but of government, feeling alienated, disheartened by the political system, feeling that your perspective, mine, as a moderate Republican, meeting in the road, being a moderate, a centrist, isn't heard. It's all about compromise and bipartisanship, but that doesn't mean compromising conservative Republican values. I'm Tyler Ruzich, and I'm a Republican for the next generation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ruzich. Next, we have opening statements from Mr. Jim Barnett.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay in the back? All right, good. I want to just especially thank the Chamber of Commerce for doing this. You know, there's been a lack of good open debate and discussion around the state because of a Republican Party debate agreement, which really makes a joke of the Republican Party platform. Now, I just want to single you out here for doing this. It's a wonderful opportunity. You know, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Rosa here in just a little bit, but we've got over 80,000 miles on our truck parked outside, and we made a special point to get down to Hutchinson to meet with the Chamber and also the hospital here to talk about issues of economic development and just Medicaid expansion and keeping our hospitals open. So I really, really like the feel of Hutch and what you're doing down here. I want to talk about Rose a little bit. You know, it's an important decision to make about your running mate, and a lot of times it's geography or money that could be brought to the ticket, or maybe political connections. I discarded all of those. I wanted somebody that I trusted, was correct on the issues, and could step in at a minute's notice should something happen to me. Now, I've been practicing 36 years. I'm in perfect health. I don't take any prescription medicines. I did spit in the cup. I don't even have any pre-Alzheimer's genes, so I'm really feeling pretty good. But we never know. Rosie's been with me on almost every meeting, and she's served in sort of the capacity of chief operating officer of embassies around the world, places like Kuwait, Afghanistan, Bosnia, when there's been sniping and shelling going on. So, talk about being under fire. Here you are, Lieutenant Governor running mate. We're under fire. But she has the capacity to help get government back on the rails in Kansas, and it really went off the rails during the last 7 years. So glad to have Rosie here. We're going to talk about our issues: ag, livestock, economic development, healthcare, education, tourism, changing our state's image, and young professionals. How do we attract and retain young people in our state? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Barnett. Next, we will hear from Patrick Kucera.
Well, once again, thank you, everyone, for taking the time to come out and listen to the important decisions that we all have to make as a state. It's an honor to stand before you. I am Patrick Kucera. My friends call me PK, so if you see me afterwards, just say, hey, PK. I'll probably respond a little better. I've been happily married 28 years to the love of my life, Mari. I'm the proud father of 6 children, and together we have served God in the ministry. But we've also served small business owners and entrepreneurs faithfully for 30 to 40 years. I started making money when I was a kid. I want to thank the Chamber of Commerce. I come here from the perspective of a global economy sitting on the advisory board of the World Chamber of Commerce. That platform has allowed me to see into consulates in 83 nations. And one of the things you're going to hear me talk about is I believe that the next governor of Kansas must have a perspective that is outside the state of Kansas. It's across America, it's across the world. We live in a global economy. I believe that the problem with Kansas that we're facing today is past administrations, including the one right now, have been so internally focused that we haven't really seen where the car is going. It's been going on for many administrations. So I'm a visionary leader. And as a visionary leader and an entrepreneur, I chose a great running mate, Miss Patricia Wrights. She's an engineer. And entrepreneurs and innovators better get surrounded by executives and engineers. I did that. I married the right woman, and I've got the right running mate. I picked the right Lord and Savior of my life. And it is my intention to bring a revival of revenue to the state of Kansas, to the farmers of Kansas, and to the families of Kansas. I believe the brand of Kansas has changed over the last decade, and it hasn't been for the good. And as the night goes along, I look forward to expounding upon how we can become a state-of-the-art state that generates a revival of revenue for you and your families. And I'm the industrial hemp guy on this stage. You're going to hear me keep talking about it all night long.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kucera. Next, we have Lieutenant Governor Tracey Mann.
Well, good evening. My name is Tracey Mann, and it's my honor to serve as the 50th Lieutenant Governor of the great state of Kansas. It's fantastic to be here. Thank you to the Hutch Chamber and the Hutch Regional Medical Center for hosting this event. I actually toured Hutch Community College 3 or 4 months ago, and it's fantastic to see all the innovative things that are happening here. It's truly, I think, an example of many things that are going right with education and could be exemplified throughout the state. I send greetings from Governor Collier, who's not able to be here tonight. You know, Governor Collier is our governor right now. He also, by profession, is a surgeon. And he is a surgeon who's willing to listen, willing to serve, and is willing to lead on the hard issues. I grew up in Quinter, Gove County, population 800. I went to a 1A or 2A high school, depending on the year. Had a fantastic public education there. I now live in Salina with my wife Audrey and our 4 small children, and I sell commercial real estate. So my background is in the commercial real estate business, working with companies. We're really excited about our campaign, and we're really excited about the direction that this state is headed. We most recently were endorsed by Kansas for Life as another candidate in this race as well. We were the only campaign that's been endorsed by the Kansas Farm Bureau. We were endorsed by the State Troopers Association. We were endorsed by the Kansas Livestock Association. And fresh off the press this afternoon, we were endorsed by the National Rifle Association, the NRA. We're very proud of all those endorsements because they are earned, not easily given, and we could not be more excited. Governor Collier and I's goals are really threefold. Number one, we want to improve this economy. And we're going to grow the economy by having a low-tax state that also has low regulations. Number two, we need to improve our education system. We believe that our kids in Kansas are an investment worth making. And three, we've got to protect and maintain our quality of life, which means being pro-Second Amendment. It also means being pro-life as well. And I'm excited to be able to be with you tonight and to talk about all these issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mann. Next up, we have Mr. Ken Selzer.
Thank you. My name is Ken Selzer. I'm a CPA. I'm a businessman, and I have been your Kansas Insurance Commissioner for the last 3.5 years. Truly, truly appreciate you picking me from a crowded group in the primary as insurance commissioner in the Republican primary, and we went on to win by a huge margin in the general election. I think I'm the one here with the most family members tonight. I've got a bunch of them sitting right down in front of me. I'd like to introduce my wife, Deb. Deb, wave big. She and I both grew up in rural Kansas. She in Miami County, just south of Kansas City, and me just over here by Gossel, Kansas, part of your reading and listening areas. Really, really proud of my rural Kansas roots. My running mate, her name is Jen Sanderson. She is from Goodland and is a huge advocate for rural communities and rural Kansas throughout the state. She is about as far from the Colorado border, which isn't very many miles, as I now live from the Missouri border, but we have deep, deep rural Kansas roots right over there by Gossel, 3 generations in a small church graveyard there, so just really, really fundamental 4th generation Kansans. So we have a problem here in Kansas, a huge problem. We're going to always be leaning in on costs. Our costs are up 6.8% this budget year compared to last budget year that ended June 30th. But worse than that, we haven't had an economy that is growing. Last year, we were dead last here in the Midwest, the ag-driven Midwest. We were dead last. That is not a record anybody should want to stand on. We talk about making Kansas grow with specific ideas. I have an ag background. Kansas is driven by ag. We have had a governor in office who is approaching this as a part-time job when we desperately need a full-time governor. We will be that full-time governor. Remember my initials. We're going to talk about it a little more later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Selzer. And next, we are going to jump right into questions. We will go in the candidate order with the next person answering the opening question, which will be Tyler Ruzich. And that question is coming to us from Cliff Shank. And Cliff, you have some questions about the priorities in the state, so I'll let you fire away.
Several of you touched on this already, but the Kansas economy has been in the doldrums for quite some time. What are your top priorities to improve the quality of life for Kansans and get the economy growing again?
All right, well, thank you, Cliff, for the great question. So I think one of the top priorities that we have to have when it comes to the economy and economic development is infrastructure. First of all, we see a lot of the infrastructure money gets lost in the state general fund. Essentially, taxpayers' dollars that are supposed to be going to infrastructure end up getting lost in the state, government bureaucracy. Money that's supposed to be going to infrastructure should be going to infrastructure to improve commerce, to make it easier to do business from one end of the state to the other. Also, I believe investment in public education, greater accountability for that, and also investing money in CTE programs ensures that Kansas students are competitive and successful in a growing global economy and an ever-competitive workforce. I also believe that providing tax incentives for farmers who invest money in soil moisture sensors and drip irrigation will ensure that the Ogallala Aquifer is an economic and environmental resources for us to use for generations to come. Thank you.
I would just like to remind our candidates, if you can pull your mic as close to you as possible so that the audience can hear. We have some out there having a little bit of a hard time hearing some of you. Next, we'll have just Mr. Jim Barnett.
Thank you. Again, the most important challenge for the next governor is we invested heavily in developing policy. What could the governor actually do? There are 4 keys to this. First, we asked businessmen and women around the state, what do you need to succeed? Over and over again, workforce training, infrastructure, education, healthcare, quality of life issues. Those were the main things they needed. 7th or 8th on the list consistently was taxes. Under the Brownback-Collier tax experiment, better called tax disaster, we zeroed out taxes for a certain few, let all those other elements go to the wayside. So the number 1 job for the next governor is restoring those key elements: workforce training, infrastructure, education, healthcare, quality of life. Second key element, our state is very different regionally. This part of the state is much different than the rest of this part of the state, so we have to approach it regionally. Next difference is looking beyond just ag, livestock, and oil, and last, a new relationship between business and education to train the workforce we need. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Barnett. Next, we have Mr. Kucera.
So I am an entrepreneurial evangelist, and some of you may have never heard of that term before, but I'm basically an evangelist for entrepreneurs, love the Chamber of Commerce. And if entrepreneurs create revenue and evangelists create revival, then I believe really what Kansas families need and what Kansas farmers need is exactly what I needed. Try raising 6 kids under 8 years old. I needed a revival of revenue myself. On July 1st, 2016, I made a decision that I would run for the position of CEO of the great state of Kansas. That's called the governor of Kansas over a multi-billion-dollar corporation called this great state. And the revival of revenue to me is not a platitude, it's something that's a reality. And I have a daughter and son-in-law that farms 16,000 acres here in western Kansas, and I believe that the industrialization of hemp is the key for the farming community. As the day goes on, as the night goes on, I'm going to expound upon that. I believe that that plant is the key to creating manufacturing jobs in plants all over central and western Kansas.
Thank you, Mr. Kucera. Next, we'll hear from Lieutenant Governor Tracey Mann.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's in many ways one of the most important questions in this campaign. Several prerequisites to growth. You know, to keep our economy growing, we have to have low taxes. That's low property taxes, low sales taxes, low income taxes. We also have to be a low regulation state. In addition to that, we all have to remember that 44.5% of the Kansas economy is agriculture. 44.5%. So if you're going to grow the Kansas economy, you have to answer as part of that, what are we going to do with agriculture? How can we help our ag producers decrease their burdensome regulations? How do we talk to countries and help get invited into their country so we can sell our ag products? Having good transportation system is a big part of that and a big part of strengthening agriculture. And lastly, to grow the economy, we've got to properly invest in education. You know, investment in education, when properly done, is huge for our economy because we need investment in education so that our workforce is trained and equipped, so that our employers have the workers they need to continue to grow, expand, and compete in a global economy. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Mann. Next, Mr. Selzer.
So the question is, what are the priorities to restart the Kansas economy, which, like we said earlier, has been flat as a pancake. It needs to grow. First of all, we need a change in the governor's office. We need somebody who's been a businessman, who understands what growth is, who knows how to make growth happen. We need a businessman in the governor's office who can lean in on costs every day along with building the Kansas economy. We're going to emphasize and are emphasizing those two things all the way through. We need to slow the outmigration in Kansas. The outmigration is killing us. We have 50,000 open jobs and our people are still moving out of state. We will never grow if we don't have enough workers to fill the jobs that we have in our state. We're going to really push that. We need to be a champion for ag. I will be a champion for ag. I grew up in ag. I'm married into ag, just like we said earlier, our own ag now. We need a champion for ag, somebody who will get out and help develop markets, build aviation and other sectors. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Selzer. Next, Mr. Wink Hartman.
Well, unfortunately for Kansas, there were 3 states last year that had negative GDP. Kansas was one of the 3. The economy is not growing and shows no signs of such. But let's understand from the business world how you can solve some of those issues if you will address them. We have the highest sales tax, 6.5%. All of the other states above us are non-income tax states. We are number 1 on the list for sales tax of the non-income tax states. We have high income taxes, period, in the state. We have high property taxes in the state. We have high regulation that stifles small businesses like what I try to run. If we are not willing to take and knock down the spending in Topeka that's ever increasing, we will never have any option to grow the economy in this state, which will bring the workforce back in instead of it migrating out because of our tax bases in so many areas.
Thank you, Mr. Hartman. Mr. Ruzich, since you were the first one to tackle this question, you'll have 30 seconds for a final wrap-up.
I would just illustrate, during the tax disaster, we have to remember who is in charge. We have to understand that Jeff Collier and Sam Brownback's tax experiment went wrong. Yes, they cut taxes, but they forgot to cut spending. You can't spend more money than you have. You can't run a state without a balanced budget. It's not fiscal responsibility. It's called fiscal recklessness. It needs to stop. We need to grow the state. We need to pass an amendment in the state's constitution to ensure we always have a balanced budget. Thank you.
All right, thank you, gentlemen. For the next question, Jim Barnett will be the first respondent, and this question comes to us from Fred Goff, and it is in relation to education funding.
Imagine that in this cycle of the election. School seems to be the hot topic with the Kansas Supreme Court decision over whether the state is meeting its obligation to fund public schools. I want your thoughts on the latest decision and what you believe the legislature will have to do to make sure education funding is adequate for the future.
I support the court's decision. Actually, back in November, I said it would take $600 million. It could have been settled then, but then the legislature commissioned another study that made that somewhat problematic. And I do support the decision that it requires inflation coverage as well. If we don't invest in our children's future, you know, our future as a state is just not going to advance. So we need a governor who's going to support that kind of funding and present that kind of budget that will be balanced and paid for. Long term, the only way we're going to be able to do that is to grow the state's economy. So that's why we have focused so much on that. Long term, if we don't change how we follow our standards and have accountability in the state, we'll be right back in court. We're using standards that come from Kentucky in the 1980s, and they're not even measurable. So the most important thing for the next governor is to see this is about leadership. This isn't about the court. It's about our kids, and develop new standards that we can have accountability for in our taxpayers and their dollars. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Barnett. Next, Mr. Kucera's response.
Well, I do not support the decision. I think the unelected Supreme Court should get out of the schools. I think they've got enough money. I think there's a whole new approach to that. But one of the other things that I like to do is to change the question. I'm not on this stage just to answer questions. I believe the next governor needs to be a visionary leader that asks new questions. And that question needs to be, what the heck are we teaching our kids? And I think that needs to be preparing them for a 21st century, innovative, entrepreneurial global economy. I believe that right now, the byproduct of the education is a resume, and many parents out there all across Kansas know kids are coming out with a resume, can't find a job, or get a job they don't like that they can't pay their bills with. It's because the educational system is behind. We need to get ahead and lead the world again with entrepreneurial education to erase the entitlement mentality that really is keeping a generation of students behind. And that's my stance on education.
Thank you, Mr. Kucera. Next, Mr. Mann.
Well, for the last 50 years, for the last 10 governors, 5 Republican, 5 Democrats, all have governed while under the threat of lawsuit from the educational system as implemented by the Supreme Court. Our administration is no exception to that. We don't think that the Supreme Court should be weighing in on how much the legislature should be funding education. We think that it should be the legislature's job to make that determination. That said, right now in Kansas, we are where we are until the Constitution gets amended. So at the start of this session, the Supreme Court laid out how much money, or laid out that more money would need to be spent on education. The governor said he would support that if, number one, it kept our schools open. Number two, it was phased in so that school districts could prepare for that money. Number 3, taxes would not be increased. And number 4, there would be tangible, specific results. All 4 things were included in the legislation that was passed and that the governor signed.
Thank you, Mr. Mann. Next up, we will have a response from Mr. Selzer.
We need to stop the litigation. We need to get out front and advocate for a constitutional amendment The governor needs to get out there in front and advocate for a constitutional amendment so the duly elected legislators can make the decision. If you don't like their decision, you can vote them out of office. It's pretty straightforward. We need a constitutional amendment that will in fact do that. And if the governor doesn't get out in front of it, it won't happen. It will not happen. We need to focus on accountability throughout the educational system so that we know our tax dollars are being efficiently spent. That means preschool education. That means K through 12. That means our community colleges and our tech schools and our universities are all held accountable for the output so they can align what they do, their output, with the needs of the local community. The successful school districts around Kansas are the ones who see themselves as the economic driver in their community. They get out and develop tech certificates and things like that. We'll talk more in a minute.
Thank you, Mr. Selzer. Next, Mr. Hartman.
Well, the only way we're going to take and stop attorneys suing us with your money, they're using your money to sue you, is to have a constitutional amendment. If Chris Kobach is elected governor, that will be very first, probably one of his top priorities as the governor to get that done so we can finally put a stop to the school funding issue. We've now committed, thanks to the President administration, another $525 million for education. But yet, the growth in education is at the top. It's at the superintendent level. The management level is growing at about 36 to 7%. The teacher level is about 16 to 17%. So the money is being thrown out the window at the top, and it's not teaching your children and your grandchildren. Chris Kobach wants to have a policy indoor legislation passed that 75 cents of every dollar goes in the classroom for teachers' salaries, computers, textbooks, something that's actually going to teach your kids. Maybe they'll learn to write cursive.
Thank you, Mr. Hartman. Next, we will have a 1-minute response from Mr. Ruzich.
So, again, as I said, it's all about the perspective. Once again, as a public school student, it's about how we spend money. For example, CTE, what we call signature programs in the Shawnee Mission School District. Instead of investing money of that in the classroom, they were all localized, where you would go to individual schools. The class sizes were smaller. Instruction was more individualized. Instead, the administration got a pay raise. We had to build this whole new multi-million-dollar building, and we shoved all of these CTE signature program students all in this one building, and therefore the class sizes are bigger. There's less individual instruction, and of course, students aren't retaining as much knowledge or information from these classes that are helping them overall in the future and being competitive in the workforce. So I think it's about where that money's spent. It should be in the classrooms. Our teachers need a pay raise as well. And once again, it's about the perspective that I can bring to the table. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ruzich. Next, Mr. Jim Barnett will have a 30-second rebuttal opportunity.
Just two quick additional items. We have generational failure of the family in Kansas. Generational slide of parenting, and the only way to break that slide is investing heavily in very early childhood learning. That is one thing that we will push. It gives me tingles to think of what we could do about that. The second thing is we used to tell everyone to go to college, get a 4-year degree, and that's wrong. And that's why with President Carter Fowler, what you're doing here with Career Technical Ed and across the state with Kansas Can is such a cool thing. We're going down the path we need to develop those jobs. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Barnett. All right, the next topic of great importance to our state and obviously to our sponsor this evening is around the topic of health care. Mr. Ron Sylvester from the Hutch News has a question for us on that topic.
Well, we have a town here in Reno County, Pretty Prairie, and they've fought water quality for years. Their nitrates are so high that they have to give bottled water to households with infants, expecting mothers, nursing mothers. What role do you think the state has in water quality and quantity for our cities?
Mr. Kucera, you will have the opportunity to answer this question first, and I apologize. I said this was a health care question. It's all about water quality. So, Mr. Kucera.
Hey, as an evangelist, I've talked about the water of life for 30 years, and water is so important, especially to the ag community, specifically the kind of water that you're talking about. This plays right into the role of why I think a visionary leader and an innovator needs to be leading the state. Vision always wins. I've been around the world, and I've been in places where water quality is worse than ours. I've been in places where they have less water than ours. I've been in places where they need to farm with a lot less to work with. And my question is, regarding anything water, is where are the leaders of the entire world? I mean the best in the world. If PK is in office in Topeka, we will find those best in the world, and they will be here. It's simply that. It's really that simple. If you have a mind of an innovator, if you have a mind of an entrepreneur, and you believe in public-private partnerships, you let the private markets, you let the real innovators, not the bureaucratic industry leaders, make those decisions. Find the innovators, find the vision, and we will win.
Thank you, Mr. Kucera. Next, we have Lieutenant Governor Mann with a response.
Yeah, Ron, I appreciate the question. Pretty Prairie is a great community. We played them in state football back when I was in high school, and they have a fantastic rodeo every summer that's great to go to. You know, the issue of water is a huge resource for our state. It's also becoming more and more of a challenge, as we all know the Ogallala Aquifer is depleting. Generally speaking, water needs to be handled on the local level. We have local groundwater management districts, and those exist because the water issues facing southwest Kansas are different from the water issues facing northeast Kansas and all over the state. And so I think it's important that there's not a top-down edict, if you will, but that it is a local, locally based decisions. That's currently how the governance of water is in the state by and large. Currently, you know, we've done a lot of work over the last few years as a state really talking about a 50-year water vision. We need to keep having those conversations. We need to put some of those things into practice, and as citizens weigh in on what they want to do, and again, the groundwater management district should be handling that. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Mann. Minister Selzer.
Just about everything we do will be guided by how we will make Kansas grow, how we will make the economy grow, how we will get it out of stuck in neutral or actually going backward like we just saw in 2017. We have to have change. That includes water quality and water issues throughout the state, including in very specific communities like you brought up. Very, very specific issues that have to be dealt with by the state government, that need to be addressed by the state government, helping the local community. We need to focus on that. We had a water plan here in Kansas for a while that really never got funded, and it wasn't a very big funding ticket. That included surface water in the eastern two-thirds of Kansas and the underground water in the western third of Kansas. We need somebody who will actually make it happen instead of just talk about it. And that means somebody who can think longer term and execute currently, a businessman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Selzer. Next, we have Mr. Hartman.
Well, I'm very familiar with the opportunities to create better water, but I'm also sadly very knowledgeable about traveling western Kansas for many, many years, quite frankly, decades, and have watched the quality and the quantity of water deteriorate continually. The leadership in Topeka presently and in the past have given lip service at best about the water that is so desperate for everybody in this room and this great state. Without water, little else matters. There has to be a water plan that's put into place, funded, and then it has to be activated. But to sit around the table in Topeka and talk about water quality and do little else, go to the grocery store. The proof is in the pudding. 20 years ago, there was hardly any water on the shelves. Now it's 5 miles long. It's being told to us right there at the grocery store, water is a problem and it needs to be addressed by strong leadership, which Chris and I will provide.
Thank you, Mr. Hartman. Mr. Ruzich.
So everyone here so far has told you that something needs to be done, but here's what I tell you, the specifics of what will be done. First of all, I believe that if you're an individual, family on a farm, if you're investing money in drip irrigation and transitioning from spray to drip irrigation, I believe that you should have a sales tax. exemption. When you're going to the grocery store food, that the state should be able to provide you an individualized status for that. As well as you could look at other tax exemptions that we could explore if you're investing money in soil moisture sensors. Yes, I believe that the state government has a role in this. I don't believe it's in the form of regulations. I believe it's in the form of rewards. That comes in the form of tax exemptions. Once again, it could be individual or family sales tax exemptions when you go to the grocery store, other things like that. So once again, if you're investing, making a positive investment in overall conserving water, I believe the state should reward you for that, not punish you for not doing so. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ruzich. Next up, Mr. Jim Barnett.
Yes, it's very much a state issue, not just a local issue. We'll talk quantity, then come back to quality. You know, the governor should be developing a multi-state plan right now for the possible transport of water, because it's a huge, huge issue. We can't stand to lose our ag economy in western Kansas because we don't have the water. Conservation should be part of that. But we should be talking with multiple states now, upstream, downstream, to work on that process so we can sustain water quantity. Quality is a huge issue too, and it definitely needs to have state involvement just for testing alone. And you know, one of the things that happened with the decimation of state services with the Brownback Collier tax experiment was that they were cut. And so we need to have possible mitigation for those communities and help them, because if you don't have water quality in your community, who's going to come and live? And we want all of Kansas to do well, rural and urban. So very much it is a state issue.
Thank you, Mr. Barnett. And we'll have the opportunity for a 30-second rebuttal from Mr. Kucera.
Well, you know, one of the things I've learned about being the first time on a political stage is how much being a pastor, dealing with people's pain and problems, their personal pain and problems, really goes with being, you know, on a political stage. I see that. And the water problems for most of our state in the agricultural sector, it must be resolved. You hear right here, local and state level. I agree with most everything I heard him say, but I also believe many of the answers simply aren't in this state. We got to go find them and go get them, and that's what I would do.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. The next question will begin with Lieutenant Governor Mann with a response to Cliff Shank's question on immigration.
The population growth in Kansas is one of the very slowest in the nation. Should Kansas aggressively recruit immigrants to the state of Kansas to increase our population growth?
I appreciate the question. You know, immigration is a federal issue. We think that Governor and I agree that we need to, as a federal government, the federal government needs to do their job. We need to secure the border, first and foremost. That's the number one thing, and it's not happening. We also, as a country, need to grapple with this issue. The governor and I do not support in-state tuition for immigrants that are here illegally. And we also know that we have to have an effective legal means for people to come into this country and to do jobs. And in many ways, that is an agricultural issue. So a lot of other businesses are touched on that as well. But agriculture is heavily reliant on immigrant workforce, and there has to be an effective, efficient, proper manner for people to come into this country legally and do these jobs that we need done to grow our economy, and that's what we support.
Thank you, Mr. Mann. Mr. Selzer, your response?
I do think our number one priority needs to be to secure the border. We need to make sure that the people who are here are legally. We need to end the lottery system. We need to limit chain migration to the immediate family. We need to end sanctuary cities here in Kansas. But here's what we do need to do as well. We need to be fully supportive of fully screened legal immigration. We need to do that. We will do that. I want to emphasize that. That could include a new H-2C program for ag workers. We desperately need ag workers. Right now, they come in under a short-term program, 6-month program, and they have to leave in 6 months after we've made a huge investment in them. A 2- or 3-year program like that is being proposed needs to happen. We will be supportive of fully screened legal immigration.
Thank you, Mr. Selzer. Mr. Hartman, your response?
Well, I want everybody to understand that Kansas is the sanctuary state of our peer group. Very, very unfortunate. When you take the Colorado, Oklahoma, Nebraska, Missouri, we are the shining star for sanctuary state amongst the group. Chris Kobach is totally 100% against illegal aliens invading our state, which takes our resources for medical care, which we're concerned about, takes water resources, takes spaces in our classrooms that are need to be cleaned up to the point where we're teaching our kids and our grandchildren. So we're all for legal immigration, but illegal aliens are not welcome in our state and should not be, just to build the population. If we would work on our tax structure, if we work on sales tax, property tax, the things I've talked about, you can generate people coming back into the jobs that are available and not have the outward flow that is created under the current administration.
Thank you, Mr. Hartman. Mr. Ruzich, your response?
You know, coming from, you know, an immigrant background, right around my age, 16, 17 years old, my great-grandparents came here from Croatia. And in fact, I was just over in Strawberry Hill in Wyandotte County by the river watching the Croatian game against France. Almost edged them out, but it was a good game. And it was overall just great to see the heritage, the proud, you know, community feeling that Kansas provides. So many great immigrant communities like that of mine and the Croatian community. And I think that's what it shows, that if we allow and promote legal immigration, if you're here to get an education, if you're here to work, pay taxes, contribute to the common good of this state, regardless of where you come from, the Ruzich administration is going to welcome you with open arms. But if you're here illegally and you've committed a crime, you will be deported. But it also starts with the family. It also starts with making sure that our younger people like myself stay here in the state. That's what I think it's all about. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ruzich. Mr. Barnett.
You know, just to get the qualifiers out, we want secure border and we don't want anyone here illegally. But the question is really, do we aggressively recruit their workforce? And the answer is yes. And it's not just them, it's anybody willing to come to Kansas and work, because we have 50,000 open jobs. If we want to grow the state's economy, the number one thing we do is fill the jobs. Every community we travel to, they're looking for workers. And part of the problem is people don't want to come to Kansas. They don't want to live here. It look like a state that can't put any money in the bank for our roads. It can't stay out of court for schools. So let's get real. We need workers here. And if you're a Native American, raise your hand. But otherwise, if you're not, we're all immigrants to this country. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Barnett. Next, Mr. Kucera.
So the question wasn't just a general overview on immigration, which we heard a lot about. It was in with specificity to the population. So I want to answer that. No, we don't need to do that. What we do need to do is plant a little plant called hemp, industrialize it, make it legal, lead the entire nation in industrialization of hemp. That little plant will translate, when processed, into thousands of products in hundreds of industries. Money goes where money grows. If you grow this little plant, it'll create manufacturing plants. Manufacturing plants create jobs. Jobs require people. People create a population. Thus the question. All we got to do is do what Kansas is best at. At one time, this state led the entire nation in the industrialization of hemp. You want a revival of revenue? Play the strengths and the cards that God gave us, and that is Kansas. Kansas is hemp. It really solves the population problem. Keeps the young talent here, attracts the capital. Money goes where money grows. Let's grow hemp.
Thank you, Mr. Kucera. All right, so Mr. Mann, you have the opportunity for a 30-second rebuttal. Okay, you'll defer. All right. The next question will be answered first by Mr. Ken Selzer, and that question comes to us from Fred Goff in relation to highway funding.
Well, there's long been criticism of the legislature taking transportation dollars to cover other expenses in the state budget. This has caused some delays in some projects, including an extension of the K-14, K-96 bypass west of Hutchinson, going past Nickerson and Sterling. Highways being used now is very dangerous, virtually no shoulders, very thin driving surface. That's just one example. There are probably many more across the state. Your thoughts on state highways and our transportation system in general?
Pathetically, our current governor and the governor before him were addicted to sweeps that came from a lot of different places, including the highway funds, huge sweeps. That needs to stop. Part of that needs to be statutorily protected. I don't think we'll ever get to the point where we'll be able to statutorily protect all of that, but we can part of that. We need to phase into it. It's such a deficit. Another issue that is so bothersome to most of us who even think about it for a few seconds, the state issues 20-year bonds on projects that last 8 years. Does that make sense to any of you? We are paying 20-year bonds on 20-year bonds long past their life cycle. We need to be a lot more thoughtful, way more thoughtful on infrastructure in Kansas, in getting the economic development results out of it, and getting safety results out of our infrastructure. Infrastructure includes broadband, a lot of issues around that. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Selzer. Mr. Hartman.
Well, the reality and the truth is, to be honest with ourselves, the $500 million that's swept annually into the state general fund, it's going to continue. Let's just be honest about it. The only way you can stop the wasteful spending, taking it out of that, is to take and start to cut the spending in Topeka. I remind you, the curve goes straight up on the continual spending in Topeka. Bigger and bigger budgets that don't balance, more and more spending, more and more tax revenue that's wasted. You're going to have to get your budget under control, get your spending down, so you can then stop sweeping the money. And there's one other last thought that you need to be very cognizant of, and I'll be the first to tell you. There's approximately 25,000 bridges in this state. Approximately 2,300 of those bridges are totally deficient. They are dangerous. They are going to get somebody killed. So we have bigger issues than how big of a shoulder. We've got bridges in every county in this state that shouldn't be used.
Thank you, Mr. Hartman. Mr. Ruzich, your response?
So I think it's not just an issue of sort of making sure that's fun. I'll talk about that later, but it's also safety on our highways. What connects, again, Lenexa and Lawrence, Johnson County, Douglas County, K-10, so many businesses, people, travel on that highway. We see it's one of the most dangerous highways in the nation. There's a lack of barriers there. There's, again, the shoulders aren't as big. So you could look at some of the state highways, which I think we really do see just aren't safe enough to be trusting businesses and residents to be traveling on. So I think we also really need to be investing money in safety measures, but also from the state general fund. We can't just give the state government, Topeka, a big old lump of money and expect them to use it responsibly. Money needs to be direct. We also need a governance that needs to be restrictive with how appropriations are set. So overall, I do believe that we need to keep money out of a general fund and make sure it's used for what it's supposed to be. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ruzich. Mr. Barnett, your response.
So the budget that Governor Collier signed does not balance, still raiding KDOT, still delaying capers, no money for roads. So if anyone answers this question and says we're going to build better bridges and more roads and tells you we're going to do this and still cut taxes, they're trying to pull the wool over your eyes, folks. They're trying to wink at you when they say it. It isn't going to happen. Money doesn't grow on trees. Any good farmer will tell you don't eat your seed corn. Kansas ate its seed corn. We are a state that lives month to month, paycheck to paycheck. We're on credit card debt, actually, when you look at how we're bonding money just for resurfacing roads, 20 years interest-only payments. So we're going to have to invest in Kansas, and we're going to pay for it. It's going to take a good governor 1 term to pivot, a really good governor 2 terms to get the state turned around, a decade to get out of the mess we got into, if not a generation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Barnett. Next, Mr. Kucera.
So I made a commitment when I ran that I wanted to change the brand of Kansas. That's what I've done for 30 years. I've helped rebrand, recreate, and redefine movements, ministries, companies. And I want to do that for the state of Kansas. I want us to go from a flyover state to a fly-to state. How many of you ever heard that we're a flyover state, right? What if we could be a fly-to state? The key is transportation. And I am putting forward, I've been talking about it all over this state, the state-of-the-art initiative, where it'd be the first in the world, state-of-the-art, A for an airport, R for railroad, and T for trucks for transportation. One of the things God has given us in Kansas is the I-35, I-70 intersection. Business is all about location, location, location. We have the best location in the country. If you have products, plant hemp, industrialize it, manufacture thousands of products in hundreds of industries, plants would pop up everywhere, and then they're talking about the state budget. You get the corporations that would benefit from the movement of all of those products, they'll help pay for it. You need to start listening to something else other than what you're hearing here.
Thank you, Mr. Kucera. Lieutenant Governor Mann.
I appreciate the question. I think it was about setting priorities and also about the funding of those priorities. You know, right now, Kansas looks and sets priorities on a 10-year time horizon. The most recent 10 years plans, if you will, are coming to an end. So there's a task force that's going to be meeting. They just were formed, finalized week before last. They'll be meeting between now and the end of the year, comprised of members from all over the state. They'll be out listening, and they will then make their recommendations to the legislature. Next spring, the legislature will make their determination on what the state's priorities are so far as projects over the next 10 years. So if there are specific issues, like specifically the road from here to Sterling, if that's of concern, now is the time to be finding the person on the task force representing you and make sure that that is properly discussed and included. Now, the legislature will determine how much, what those priorities are, and then the legislature will also weigh in on the funding of those priorities. Certainly, we have to properly fund transportation. It impacts our urban areas. It also impacts our rural areas as well, and I don't think there's anyone on the stage that disagrees with that.
Thank you, Mr. Mann. Mr. Selzer, you get the opportunity for a 30-second response.
Somebody mentioned just a minute ago that we've got a $7 billion budget that is out of control in terms of how rapidly it is growing. Out of that $7 billion budget, $1.1 billion is highway maintenance operations of KDOT. We need more efficiency throughout state government, including in KDOT. We need to better manage our state operations and demand more accountability so we get more out of it. That includes managing our maintenance better so that we can have more money to dedicate to new projects.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. The next question will be led by Mr. Hartman, and that question comes to us from Ron Sylvester of the Hutch News.
So you've all touched a little bit on taxes, but we've kind of been up and down literally with that. 2012, we gave an income tax break. 2015, we raised sales tax. 2017, we brought back the income tax. Where does tax policy go under your administration? And please, if you say you're going to cut taxes, provide some specifics on spending cuts that go along with that.
Well, Ron, thank you very much for the question. That's very, very key to what my background is all about. We need to understand that everybody wants to use the word efficiency or cut and cut this and cut that. The first thing you have to do in your home budget or in the businesses I run, I have to control spending. I have to control the flow of revenue. If I can't control the flow of revenue, then I will not be able to take and reduce taxes and or reduce other expenses. So let's make it very, very clear how this works. The Brownback-Collier tax cut of 2012 was not a bad policy. The implementation of that policy was terrible. It was blindfoldedly run off a cliff, increase spending, decrease taxes, and of course there was a train wreck. What we should have had is a road stop along the highway of this project to see where we are budget-wise, revenue-wise, before we continue to dig a deeper and deeper hole for ourselves as they did.
Thank you, Mr. Hartman. Next, Mr. Ruzich.
So I think that overall, that Kansas families, Kansas individuals should not see any tax increases under my administration. I believe that if there is any, group or tax increase that we could maybe see, I believe just a minuscule amount on bigger businesses that have more than 50 employees. But essentially, what I do believe in is that. If we were to, once again, decrease taxes on families or at least make sure that we don't raise it, I believe that we could cut spending in the defined benefit program and, again, then divert more employees to more 401k-like programs. So essentially, I believe also that it's all about where we're spending our money. If we're going to cut taxes, we have to make sure that we're cutting spending as well. And the problem, again, with the Brownback-Collier tax policy is it was a lack of leadership. You can't cut taxes and increased spending. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ruzich. Mr. Jim Barnett, your response?
General comments on tax policy, but first I commend the legislators that had the courage to override Governor Brownback's veto of the tax bill to recreate a new economic foundation for this state. We were almost insolvent. Many Kansans hurt, many communities hurt, so I commend them for having the courage to make those votes. I support the three-legged stool. Income tax got lopped off and the stool fell over. Sales tax on food is the worst food, and that is the tax that I will first work to reduce. Property tax, tough for those on fixed income and in ag, and when the state didn't balance their budget, it shoved it back on local communities, so property tax went up at the local level. Failing to expand Medicaid has raised local taxes across the state. As we send our dollars out of state to for-profits, cities and communities across the state raise sales tax and property tax. Again, a perfect storm. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Barnett. Next up, Mr. Kucera, your response?
Yeah, the response of an entrepreneurial evangelist. I do not commend them. It was the worst move and the biggest mistake maybe in the history of Kansas, if you look at it from the brand of Kansas. How inept to raise Kansas taxes with the largest tax increase that followed the largest tax decrease. That is like going off the road on one side of a highway and then overcorrecting and crashing on the other side. You know what? It's so internally focused, so short-term minded that they really didn't even think about what message that would send to businesses around the country and around the world that I, sitting on the World Chamber of Commerce Advisory Board, of trying to get to come to Kansas. It was a curse to our brand. It must be corrected, and I would do everything I can to make sure that never happened again to the state of Kansas and the brand of Kansas. If we're going to have a revival of revenue, you can't just manage spending. That's all you're hearing about here. I believe the state can make more money, and that's what the revival of revenue is all about. Entrepreneurs create revenue, not just control spending.
Thank you, Mr. Kucera. Mr. Mann.
Yeah, you're hearing a lot of doom and gloom on the stage and a lot of talk about the past. I'll tell you, Governor Collier and I are laser focused on moving forward. And how do we build a Kansas that all of our kids will want to live in? You know, the state is in a much more physically healthy than it's been in quite some time. The two bond rating agencies, Moody's and S&P, both over the last few weeks have upgraded the bond rating for Kansas, which is a sign of economic health. We are moving in the right direction. Now, specific to taxes, our least favorite tax, or this tax that I hear a lot of frustration with all over the state, would be property taxes. And that hits our urban areas, that hits our business owners, our homeowners. Of course, it hits agriculture incredibly hard. You know, agriculture right now is a biggest part of our economy. Farm incomes are down 25, 50% or greater over their peak a few years ago. At the same time, their property taxes are increasing. So if there's one area to focus on that we have a lot of concerns about, it's all taxes, but specifically property taxes. Thanks.
Thanks, Mr. Mann. Mr. Selzer.
The governor says he's moving in the right direction, but we're not. Just 4 days ago, CNBC moved us into the bottom third of all states to do business in the United States. First time we've been there. 10 years ago, 8 years ago, like I said, we were in the top 7. Then we moved to the bottom of the top third. Now we're in the bottom third. And part of that is because we don't have stability in policy. We don't have a businessman who can think forward a few years. Businesses want stability. We need to lean in on costs every day, every minute of every day, and we need to make Kansas grow. That will happen when we have a stable tax policy, and we're going to pursue that. We're going to gradually reduce taxes over time, like most states when they move in that direction, rather than cut the rug out under one spot. Just like was alluded to before, $800 million decrease in revenue, and now up $1.2 billion. That makes no sense.
Thank you, Mr. Selzer. So, Mr. Hartman, you'll have a 30-second opportunity to reply.
Well, at the end of the day, it comes down to one thing. We have to put our arms around the way Topeka spends your money. It's your money. It's the equity you have in this great state. Until we get our arms around that, we will not be able to be effective in reducing property taxes, sales tax, income tax, and the regulation that is stifling the economy of this great state. people will move back in for the jobs that are available. We have to build a better structure for them to survive.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. The next question, we'll begin with a response from Mr. Ruzich, and this question comes to us from Cliff Shank of Ad Astra Per Aspera Broadcasting. Cliff, it's an interesting topic, and it just shows how diverse our state is, so fire away with your question.
In Kansas, there's an urban-rural split. How would you bridge the divide and serve the entire state of Kansas?
Right. So I think especially what overall can be done is here in Hutchinson, Reno County, could be more money in tourism. In fact, when I was very surprised when I was watching the county commissioner debate that there was, I believe, what, about $13,000 that is allotted for Reno County to market. To me, it very much surprises me and worries me. It really decreases the ability for Reno County, places again here like Hutch, to say to people across the rest of the state, come to Hutch, come visit us on 17th, or, you know, come spend the day on Main Street. So I think a good way to maybe bridge the divide is to bring people throughout all the corners of the state. And I think a lot of that starts with tourism. And again, as well as I do believe it's all about commerce. If we aren't spending money in infrastructure, we're getting all that lost in the general fund. It becomes a lot harder to do business from one end of the state to another. So it's commerce and it's tourism, I think, are where we could begin. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ruzich. Next up, Mr. Jim Barnett.
Oh, I love the question. You know, we've got, as I said, over 80,000 miles on the truck. Original tires, I can't believe how much tread is still on those tires. One new windshield, we got rocked to death in Wichita. We listened to people for a year just wondering if we should do this. We heard certain words over and over again. The word one, the word unite, and the words work together. And, you know, driving down the road one day, we looked at each other and said, let's make the theme of our campaign One Kansas. Hashtag One Kansas, so you know we're social media savvy, okay? If we don't work together and unite, we're not going to solve any problems. If we don't unite, we will not bridge the partisan divide that makes Topeka dysfunctional. And if we don't unite, we will not bridge that rural-urban divide. We want all of Kansas to do well. We've been out to western Kansas 13, 14 times. We know the state goes all the way to Colorado. And we've been in every corner. And we will commit full-time to working for all of Kansas. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Barnett. Mr. Kucera, your response?
So once again, July 1st, 2016, I started to really think about how it would change us from a flyover state to a fly-to state, create a real revival of revenue. One of the things that needed to happen was to wire up the West. I have a whole program called Wiring Up the West. That's one of the ways to connect the East with the West doing business together. The second thing is I'm one of the leading innovators in the aviation sector. I don't talk about it a lot because a lot of it's very covert right now. We've not gone public, but it's been a 10-year project, millions of dollars in. It will change the aviation universe, actually. And why not out of the aviation center of the universe here in Kansas? So there's going to be something great. That will connect the East to the West. Secondly, or thirdly, the hemp revolution and the agricultural products that you've been hearing me talk about, they're going to get transported from the West to a multimodal hub in the state-of-the-art, which is at I-35 and I-70. We're going to build an airport, if I'm elected, on the Kansas side. We're going to combine that with rail and trucks for transportation. That's how you make an interdependency happen.
Thank you, Mr. Kucera. Mr. Mann?
You know, it's interesting. When I look at Kansas, I think of all of us as Kansans. Whether we live in an urban environment, in a rural environment. I grew up in Quinter. The governor grew up in Hayes. I lived in Roland Park for a while in Kansas City. The governor lives in Overland Park. I live in Salina, population 50,000. Together, we've kind of lived at all the different spectrums, if you will, of the size of communities in this state. You know, we've got to figure out how we advance this whole state forward and not get caught up in rural versus urban divides, because what urban areas and rural areas need in many ways is the same, and that is for communities to grow and for our economy to grow, we need good schools, we need good hospitals, we need good access to internet or broadband, we need good quality housing, we need child care, and we need good jobs. And that's true whether you live in a town of 800 like Quinter or if you live in Overland Park. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Mann. Mr. Selzer?
I know I can bring the different parts of Kansas together. I'm the Wildcat that married the Jayhawk, and we're still married after 38 years. Just like I said, I am so proud of my Jayhawk wife, even though I bleed purple. I bleed purple. But there's so many things that we can talk about in the same vein. Rural Kansas doesn't want sales tax on farm equipment. Urban Kansas doesn't want sales tax on services. It's the same issue. Nowhere across the state does anybody want property taxes except those legislators that want to spend more and more. That's the only place it's coming from. There's huge property values in the urban parts of the state, and a property tax rate increase from the state would hurt them more than anywhere else. Rural Kansas absolutely doesn't want property tax rate increases from the state. So many common things. The school issue, there's a little bit of a split there, but we can overcome that. I grew up in rural central Kansas. My lieutenant governor is from western Kansas. I now live in eastern Kansas. We can bring it together. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Selzer. Mr. Hartman, your response?
Well, we need to start thinking in terms of Kansas first, one Kansas, all 105 counties. I started out at 14 years old working in Garden City, Kansas in the oil field. 110 degrees, painting tank batteries, but that's what I had the privilege to do for my father. But I learned a lot. I learned a lot growing up in Garden City in the summers and growing up in schools in Wichita, Kansas. I understand every county has a separate need to be successful. We do not want competition or create competition between urban and rural. We have to join hands and pull the rope from the same end. And if we do, that's part of building our economy. That's part of filling those jobs. That's part of our educational system. So we have to have a leader that understands how to put people at the conference table, come to a consensus, so we can all move the ball together. And that will make Kansas strong.
Thank you, Mr. Hartman. Mr. Ruzich, you can have a 30-second response.
Yeah. So the other thing I also want to make sure that we illustrate is telemedicine. It's so important that just because you live in Wichita County where there's very few clinics or access to clinics, that you don't have to go drive miles away to get access to care. If you're an elderly citizen or you live in a more rural county like Wichita, then you should be able to get access to telemedicine. I think the state can invest more money in telemedicine so that you can get access to quality care from the comfort of your own home. Thank you.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. All right, it is 6:42, which means we have time for one more question for each of you before we have closing remarks. So we had two more questions, though, on the slate. Fred Goff has a question about tariffs, and Ron has a question about your favorite tourism location. So I'm going to let our panelists decide which one of these two topics do you want these folks to address?
We'll do tariffs.
Tariffs win. All right, Fred, fire away.
With the tariffs put in place by President Donald Trump, that could have an impact on farmers wanting trade to get their products overseas and even to Canada and Mexico. Your thoughts on the tariffs, and is there anything at all that a governor could do to help these farmers, in fact, if they are impacted?
You know, of course, this is somewhat a reflection really on President Trump in terms of his leadership, and it's always a head scratcher for me on that, and I always like to look at each individual issue, and so today we'll talk about tariffs on an individual basis, but I think it's highly risky. It's been tough on ag with, again, property taxes up and commodity prices low, and I know there's a great concern among ag across the state about the negative impact this is going to be, and it's a great concern for a lot of bankers as well that know that many people are really ready to go belly up right now. So we need to have communication, of course, between the Office of Governor and our representatives in Washington and, of course, in the President's office as well. This also is one of the reasons that I have interest in my running mate, because Rosie has supported those around the world who deal with ag, deal with markets, deal with trade, and we need that kind of person in the office to work on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Barnett. Mr. Kucera.
I love Donald Trump, and I want to tell you why. Because he's an entrepreneurial evangelist. He's an evangelist for the entrepreneurial spirit. He's the evangelist for the American dream. He's a breath of fresh air after a decade of desolation. And what he has done is said, I am going to put America first. Sometimes he doesn't think about the individual state like Kansas. He's thinking about America first. You know, when you heard him talk about being in the room with evangelical pastors, I was blessed to be one of those. I was there in his presence, and I know people who are in his presence, and this is what I can assure you. What he does is in the overall best interest of America. And what you see on TV over here might not be what he's doing over here. He understands leverage, he understands how to win, and he's playing a different game than politicians in the swamp have played for years. If you like that, I got a little bit of that personality style in myself, and I think there's a good old boy network in Topeka that could use a little dose of that itself. So that's what I want to do.
Thank you, Mr. Kucera. Mr. Mann, your response? We'll start the timer over. Leanne, do you have the timer
You'll applaud
going?
me before I answer the question? That's great.
All right, 1 minute for Lieutenant Governor.
Access to foreign markets is critical for our ag producers, our crop growers, and our livestock producers. That's the bottom line. We support the president in his efforts and continue to want to work with him along with our partners at the Kansas Farm Bureau, the American Farm Bureau, and our federal delegation as he seeks to negotiate better, fairer, more free tariff or trade agreements that'll positively impact all of us for generations to come. It's difficult now. We all know that. We have actively been advocating to the administration and letting them know how these tariffs impact our Kansas producers. That's been communicated by the governor directly to the president. It's been communicated directly to the vice president. The Secretary of Agriculture, Sonny Perdue, was in Kansas a little over a month ago. We had a long discussion with him about that and others as well. And additionally, the governor has had the general consulate from Japan, other countries, invited them in, talking to them about purchasing our goods. And on the tourist question, my answer would be the Quinter Dairy Queen on I-70 exit 107, best tourist spot in Kansas. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Lieutenant Governor. Mr. Selzer, your response.
The tariffs are hugely damaging to Kansas. Soybeans hit a 10-year low last week. Pork supplies are at an all-time high since 2002 or so. Prices dropping like a lead rock. It's going to be a huge issue for Kansas, the Kansas economy to overcome. Remember, we're going to make Kansas grow. But where is our governor in standing up for Kansas farmers? Why isn't he banding together with other governors to make our voice heard in the president's office? We need to make that happen. What does our Secretary of State know about ag? We need somebody who's a businessman, who grew up in ag, knows ag, and can sell Kansas, be a champion for Kansas. That has to be our #1 priority. We need somebody who can try to repair the damage that's already happened to the markets. We've got some permanent damage already done to our ag markets because China and other places are going other places to buy their product. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Selzer. Next, we'll have a response from Mr. Hartman.
Well, the situation, first of all, is I back Donald Trump 100%. We have to give the gentleman time to negotiate and try to get the job done. We can't say our hair's on fire the first week. I was in an event last night in Emporia, probably 35 to 40 farmers there. I talked to every single one of them. And to a person, they all said the same thing. Give the man a chance. It may be short term, but long term it's going to be great gain for me and my family. So they support the president also on that issue. That said, I own 8 community banks, all in small towns. And our #1 business we do in those banks is ag. Lines of credit for the farmers to survive 1 more year, to buy fertilizer, to replace machinery, to fix machinery. So I have a, if you will, frontline battle with helping the farmers and creating opportunities for them to be there when the tide turns, because it will, just like the oil industry is finally making the turn.
Mr. Ruzich.
So these tariffs are not what Donald Trump had promised Kansas voters in 2016. Donald Trump promised Kansas voters, Kansas farmers, that there would, first of all, there would be lower taxation, that there would be more competition, and there would be more room to grow. Soy is going to be rising in prices. We're going to see other agricultural products that are also going to be rising in prices. And overall, we say we have to get them in time, but Farmers don't have time. This is a very, very competitive market. If, once again, if we aren't investing money or providing incentives for our farmers to invest money in conserving the Ogallala Aquifer, for example, then the agriculture business isn't going to be here. If the tariffs continue to move forward, then we're going to see it's going to be harder to do business here in the state of Kansas. And once again, with Jeff Collier, where is the leadership? There's lack of leadership. Our governor needs to stand up for the interests of Kansas farmers and not for these tariffs that hurt Kansas farmers. Thank you.
Mr. Barnett, your rebuttal.
Real briefly, just so you know, I grew up on a farm near Reading, 17 miles from Americus. Had asthma and hay fever as a kid and decided not to farm, but I'm really still very connected to agriculture. The other thing we should talk about is the Department of Commerce. We used to have a Department of Commerce that was funded with international representatives around the world helping us with trade and new markets. And due to the, again, failure of the Brownback-Collier administration, those were all cut. And that's part of why our economy is still sucking air. Thanks.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. So now we have reached the part of the forum where you can give your closing remarks. We'll allow each of you 2 minutes for your closing, and we will begin with PK, Mr. Kucera.
Well, picking up on what he just said about the Department of Commerce, that's the reason why. It's the biggest reason why. I think that as you look at the differences between the candidates, you know, I've never been elected. I'm just like you. I'm a voter. As a matter of fact, I voted for a couple of the candidates. But what you need to look at is in this day and age, what really is needed is a global-minded, globally connected person to lead our state. I compare myself differently to the people that I'm running against. They're very internally focused, good executives, great managers. That's who I hire in my businesses. You see, I'm not a very good auto mechanic, and I come from a farming background as well, and when things broke down, I wasn't really good at fixing them. What I'm pretty good at is determining what kind of vehicle that I want to drive, and most of all, putting the GPS coordinates in that car and saying, this is where I'm going. So if you want managers and executives, you got some great choices. And this, I believe that will manage the state. As a matter of fact, I've heard the word manage about 12 times in this debate. If you want a manager, Kansas will be the same in 4, 8, 12 years. It will not be different. The brand won't change. We'll still be a flyover state. Everything I'm talking about will change the state and put us on the map. I will use all of my relational connections from the World Chamber of Commerce on the advisory board and many others to really bring what is not here. Ask yourself this question. When CEOs are doing poorly within a company and they get fired, do they promote from within? When athletic teams fire a head coach, do they bring up the assistant coaches or do they fire them and bring in a whole new coaching staff? Everything you're hearing here requires someone from the outside with a different perspective, and it needs to be an entrepreneurial, innovative perspective. There's some great minds in Kansas, and some of the best minds aren't running for governor. I can get counsel and advice to look under the hood and be internally focused to help make these decisions. Thank you for your time. May God bless you, and may you be a blessing to God.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kucera. Next, we will have closing remarks from Lieutenant Governor Tracey Mann.
Well, thank you. It's been a delight to be here. Thank you for coming out and spending an hour and a half of your time being here in the air conditioning tonight. You know, for me as Lieutenant Governor, when things come into my office or come my way, I view it through 4 different people. So every issue I think through the lens of 4 different people. And those 4 different people are Quincy, who's my 7-year-old, Austin, who's my 4-year-old, Whitney, who's my 3-year-old, and Elise, who's my 9-month-old. In other words, how do we build a Kansas that Quincy, Austin, Whitney, and Elise will want to live in, raise a family in, have a good education in, have a great job in, and ideally their children and grandchildren want to live here as well. Governor Collier is the governor and is the man to bring that dream, bring that idea to fruition. You know, you hear a lot of things on the stage, a lot of gloom and doom about how bad things are. The bottom line is Kansas is doing well. Kansas is moving forward. We have different opinions on how we're going to get there. We appreciate and respect that. You know, a lot of candidates will talk about what they're going to do. We're doing it. A lot of people would talk about things in the past. There's a reason that God put two eyes on the front of your head and none on the back of your head, because we're not looking in the past. We are moving forward. Our campaign's going great. We're leading in the polls. We're the only campaign that's been endorsed by the Kansas Farm Bureau. We're the only campaign that was endorsed by Kansas for Life. I'm sorry, one other campaign was endorsed by Kansas for Life. We're the only campaign that has been endorsed by the Kansas Livestock Association. We've also been endorsed by the Kansas Troopers Association, which is the head law enforcement agency in the state. And today we found out we're the only campaign that's been endorsed by the NRA. We're moving ahead. Kansans are excited. We'd appreciate your vote on August 7th. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lieutenant Governor. Next, Ken Selzer has his final remarks.
I am the only candidate on this stage who has proved he can lead in business, successfully lead in business, and lead in government. In my department, we cut costs, lowered the number of employees by 20%, and we helped improve customer service dramatically. My department won an award, a third-party award, that said we were the second highest rated insurance department in the entire United States, second only to Texas, which had 4 times the population, 4 times the people, 4 times the budget. We were one of the very best in the nation because we took a business-like approach to running that department. We're going to do the same for the full government. I want you to know we're going to lean in on costs and we're going to make Kansas grow. Kansans deserve a full-time governor, not a part-time physician, not a Secretary of State who wants to work in other states with their issues. We need a full-time governor, an 80-hour governor a week. We got a lot to work on. We have so much we need to do. We're going to give you 100% focus. I promise you that. Just remember one thing. My initials are KS. Remember KS for KS on August 7th, or Ken and Jen for my running mate. Either one works, but remember KS for KS. I'll see you at the voting booth. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Selzer. Next, we'll have closing remarks from Mr. Wink Hartman.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, at the end of the day, you're going to have to decide amongst all of the people in front of you which one you believe is the true leader that has the decades of experience of understanding budgets, understanding spending and how to control it, how to work with regulation, overtaxation, how to deal with the things that you and I have to deal with on a daily basis. I want to be your person in Topeka that puts my feet under the conference table to make the decisions that will be good for you and your family, for your children and your grandchildren, because I want them to stay in our great state. I want them to find jobs, raise a family here just like we have. We can do this together, but if we aren't going to join hands after this election is over, we will fail once again. So I hope you will stay strong with Chris Kobach and Wink Hartman. I will be a full-time lieutenant governor, not one that shows up at charity dinners, not one that shows up at the Capitol once in a while. I will be standing there arm in arm with Chris every day to make this state better for you. Quickly, we were also endorsed by KFL, Kansas for Life. We were also endorsed by the Kansas State Rifle Association. We were also endorsed by Guns of America, which is a part of the NRA. The NRA endorsed one of my competitors because that is their policy. Chris Kobach also deserved and earned an A from the NRA, although they always endorse the incumbent governor. So if endorsements are what you want, I think that will lack in leadership from Topeka. Let's put the endorsements aside and pick the people that have the experience to get the job done so we all move forward together. Thank you so much, and I appreciate your consideration on August 7th.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hartman. Next, we'll have closing remarks from Mr. Tyler Ruzich.
And again, thank you to everyone here, Ron, Fred, and Cliff, for asking some great questions, and again to the Hutch Chamber and the Hutch Regional Medical Center for making this event possible, and the great people of Hutch and Reno County for showing that you care and you want to make a good, informed decision in August and in November. I think the choice is clear for you all. If you are satisfied with what's going on in Topeka, then you have three great candidates for you. But if you want an outsider, then maybe you've narrowed it down to 2. But what I would say is that it's all about the perspective. If you want someone who's willing to meet in the middle, someone who prioritizes compromise, but knows that doesn't mean compromising Republican and conservative values, I'm your guy. If you want meeting in the middle and a moderate approach, not just to guns, but also my perspective on education, then I'm your guy. If you also want the specifics on agriculture, you also want us to be rewarding farmers who take positive investment in preserving the Ogallala aquifer for generations to come, then I'm your guy. If you want a new perspective in Topeka that has been silenced by the recent age restriction that was signed by Governor Collier to prevent me from running for re-election, then I'm your guy. Also, if you want somebody that's for the values of the Republican Party, open dialogue, and not for the debate contract that was signed for the candidates, then I'm your guy. If you say to yourself, well, why is this a problem? Or then, I want to seek out these solutions. I'm someone that doesn't just see struggle and ask why. I'm someone that dreams things that never were and ask why not. I'm Tyler Ruzich, and I'm a Republican for the next generation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ruzich. Well said. All right, we will have closing remarks next from Mr. Jim Barnett.
Thank you very much. I want to close with just a few comments on issues and values. I support Medicaid expansion. I know we didn't have time to talk about it tonight, but if you don't have access to health care, you lose a life, you lose a limb. So we should support Medicaid expansion. When I'm governor, that will happen. We have to restore our mental health care system. It's been systematically dismantled in Kansas under the Brownback-Collier administration. I never thought I would see Kansas address mental health care in 4 ways. 1, our emergency rooms where they're not safe. 2, our jails, which is really the wrong place for them to be, of course. 3, our schools where they're not prepared for them. Or 4, in our homeless shelters. The next governor is going to have to restore functioning state government. DCF, think of the unspeakable things that have happened in DCF. Kids beaten, strangled, encased in cement, fed to the pigs, left under bridges for months. This is how low we went. People want to know, am I a moderate, am I a conservative, or what other label? I've been called quite a few things through the years, frankly. I don't really like labels. I will tell you this, I represent the values of most Kansans. Let's educate our children, let's build our roads, let's take care of those less fortunate, and pass on something better. And we have failed on all of those measures in the last 7 years with Brownback and Collier. If we do not elect the right governor and lieutenant governor, we will lose this state. We will never know Kansas like we knew it in the past or loved it. And it's going to take a governor and lieutenant governor to make those hard decisions and invest in this state. So if you share our values, vote for Barnett and Hanson on August 7th. If you don't, you have heard the mantra again tonight. Smaller government, lower taxes, fixes everything. That is what brought us the disasters in DCF and mental health care and beyond. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Barnett. Well, with that, we are putting a wrap on this debate this evening. We appreciate these gentlemen so much for sharing of their ideas and time with us. Let's give these candidates another round of applause. In closing, I want to say a couple of other thank yous. Thank you to our panelists from the Hutch News, from Ad Astra, Paraspo Broadcasting, and from Eagle Radio. Thanks again to our sponsor, Hutchinson Regional Healthcare System, and thank you all for coming tonight. Have a good evening.